Good day ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Goat Guides. For today's video, we're going to look at a very personal deck to me, as it not only consisted of the very first ultimate rare I ever pulled, but was also the very first competitive deck I ever built, having used an article in the UK magazine Yugioh World to make it. As this is going to be my birthday very soon, I'm giving myself an early present. So that being said, let's take a look at Monarchs. Whether it being the more popular Soul Control variant or the more recent aggro decks, all Monarch decks try to win in roughly the same way, by summoning the 2400 attack 1 tribute beaters known as Monarchs that all have different effects upon being tribute summoned, and ideally using cards to tribute their opponent's monsters to bring them out. We then use their incredible attack points and effects to beat down our opponent for game. Now before starting this video, one thing I'd like to point out is that Goat format Monarchs is probably the weakest Monarchs ever have been, as this predates Treeborn Frog and Rise of the Storm Monarchs release, two cards that push the deck into tier 1. If this deck does well, I'm probably going to do a follow-up video where I discuss the history of this deck, as like I said, it's one of my favourite decks of all time and I'd like to show people how it evolved over the years. Let's begin this video with a look at our Monarchs. Thessalos the Fire Monarch is a level 6 Pyro monster, and like all Monarchs he has 2400 attack points and 1000 defense points. And upon being tribute summoned successfully, he allows you to snipe a random card from your opponent's hand, and if that card's a monster he does 100 points of damage to the opponent for each star that monster has. This card is the key Monarch in the Soul Control variant of the deck, which is all about using Soul Exchange to summon the Monarchs, and then using their abilities to go +1 in card advantage. Thessalos is the most likely to achieve this, as our opponents may not always have a backward pop with MOBIUS, or a monster to destroy with ZABORG, but it's likely they will always have at least one card in hand to discard. Also, the potential damage this card can do to an opponent somewhat works to offset the downside of Soul Exchange, which stops you from attacking the turn it's played. Next up we have the aforementioned first secret rare I ever opened in MOBIUS the Frost Monarch. When this water monster is tribute summoned, it allows us to pop up to 2 spell and trap cards on the field. Out of all the Monarchs, this is the only one to see consistent play in both control and aggro builds, as he is good at both clearing our way for an attack and depleting our opponent's resources, while also going +1. In fact, Mobius is such a good answer to back row that he even sees some side deck play in non-Monarch decks. In the right circumstances where your opponent has at least 1 monster and 2 back row, he can even be a +2. In many cases, given many Goat players don't set much back row, Mobius can be just as powerful as Heavy Storm, yet at least in my experience it's not played around nearly as much, which often means Mobius can destroy more back row than Heavy Storm. Finally, Mobius is the ideal Monarch to play when we're ready to swing for game, as most monsters in this format can't go toe-to-toe with any of the Monarchs, so removing their back row often leads to most of them being trampled over in battle. Moving on to the Monarchs that are more home swinging at our opponent's face, we have ZABORG the Thunder Monarch. The only non-level 6 Monarch, ZABORG is a level 5 light monster with the ability to destroy 1 monster on the field when tribute summoned. By the way, just know that this effect is not optional, so make sure you actually have a target when summoning this card or it will blow itself up. Now there isn't any reason why this card couldn't slot into a Soul Control list, and in fact some do, particularly versions of the deck that play a Chaos Engine, as ZABORG is a good light target. However, these days many Soul Control versions use a different tribute monster for repeated monster removal, so this isn't seen as often. However, in aggro Monarchs this card is invaluable. So trying to win as fast as possible, having a guaranteed piece of removal can mean the difference between a game-winning direct attack and an unanswerable chaos monster. ZABORG, along with Mobius, are the most important Monarchs in this variant of the deck, as between them it's very easy to leave out opponents with very little guarding the life points. Finally, in both versions of the deck, ZABORG being a level 5 grants the deck access to level 5s as well as 6s with Metamorphosis. For similar reasons, aggro Monarchs also run 1 to 2 copies of Grandmag the Rock Monarch, a rock monster that upon being tribute summoned allows us to destroy 1 face-down card on the field, essentially being both a weaker Noble Mana Crossout and a weaker Mystical Space Typhoon. Now again, this is more often played in aggro due to the deck wanting to clear the field as often as possible to attack for direct damage. However, I would argue this card could also be side-decked in standard Monarchs as an answer to Goat and Chaos decks, since it can be excellent at answering several of those decks' best cards, like Magician of Faith and Magical Merchant. Outside of the Monarchs themselves, some variants of these decks have branched out into other tribute monsters. For example, aggro builds of this deck tend to be splashing Jinzo, while control builds often run BLOWBACK Dragon. Now the reason that aggro monarchs were in Jinzo was fairly obvious. The last thing we want when attacking with our big monsters is to be blown up by a mirror force or Sakuretsu armor. However, blowback dragon I'd like to explore a little as it's not as played as often. At level 6, this card allows us to flip 3 coins and destroy 1 monster if it lets 2 of these land on heads. While this effect is random, the ability to destroy 1 card each turn can be very powerful in a deck that's trying to make the game last a while and win with more resources than the opponent. Finally, a card that saw play in the 2005 iteration of Soul Control, but has somewhat fallen by the wayside, is Sacred Phoenix of Nethys, as well as its support card, the Hand of Nethys. A 2 tribute monster, the Sacred Phoenix has the ability to revive itself each turn if destroyed by card effect, a lot like Vampire Lord, and upon being special summoned, it heavy storms the field. This card was very popular back in the 2005 days, even being played by Evan Vargas in the deck that first put Soul Control on the map. However, many decks have since stopped playing this card and instead either play a great number of Monarchs or splash a small Chaos Engine. Honestly, I'd say possibly run this card if your meta is very back row heavy, but otherwise I do think other cards have surpassed it these days. Moving on to the rest of our monster lineup, I have to say that Monarch has one of the most flexible monster slots of any GOAT deck, with numerous different ways to go about building the deck. As such, in this video I've listed the most popular monsters run in both versions of the deck, but I fully encourage you to try out other monsters you think could work well in this deck, because chances are good they will. Firstly, we'll look at monsters seen in most forms of Monarch decks, regardless of type. Staples such as Sangan, Magician of Faith, Sinister Serpent, and potentially Breaker the Magical Warrior. Serpent's ability to dual-proof your deck and be a potential attack absorber is something I've already covered. However, it's also a piece of tribute fodder, since when it comes back you're essentially getting the monster for free. For similar reasons, Sangan also has additional value in this deck, as it gets its effect regardless of how it's sent to the graveyard, so you can end up losing no card advantage after tributing the Sangan for a Monarch, and then adding a card from your deck to your hand to replace said Monarch. Next we have the format's premier beta in Breaker the Magical Warrior. Now, being a 1900 attack monster already makes this card good in this deck, as he's hard to run over, thus making him good tribute fodder, but his spell popping effect can be good in games 2 and 3, as it can be used to pop side decked cards such as Mask of Restrict, in addition to the usual targets like Mirror Force. Finally, we have Magician of Faith, which in addition to its usual plan of recovering Pot of Greeds and Graceful Charities, can also be used to recover our control spells to bring out multiple tribute monsters at our opponent's expense. Moving on to each deck's unique monsters, we'll look at the aggro build first, as this build tends to have less monsters so it can play more spells. First up we have aggro staple Asura Priest. With its ability to attack each monster on our opponent's side of the field, Asura Priest is this deck's main answer to GOAT tokens, which often makes it hard for our Monarchs to do any damage. This card is one of 2 aggressive cards that make aggro Monarchs a decent alternative to Soul Control by improving the deck's chances against Chaos and GOAT control. In addition to this, the deck also runs Twin-Headed Behemoth as its main piece of tribute fodder. A 1500 attack dragon, Twin-Headed Behemoth has the ability of reviving itself as a 1000 attack and defense monster on the turn that it's destroyed. This makes it the ideal tribute fodder in this deck, as it can run over a fair amount of monsters in the field turn 1, while its effect pretty much guarantees it'll stick around long enough for a tribute summon for the next turn. Moving over to the control deck, we see a very different set of monsters, which highlight the differences between both versions of Monarch. While aggro Monarch must pump out as many Monarchs as possible and end the game quickly, Soul Control is trying to win through attrition, controlling the field and drawing a bunch of cards. As such, the 2 main monsters that differentiate the Soul Control from aggro are Dakoichi the Battle Steam Locomotive and Dark Mimic Level 1, 2 flip monsters that allow us to draw cards upon being flipped. The goal for Soul Control is to have these monsters survive the turn, and then use them for a tribute after their effect has drawn us a card to replace the Monarch we're using. This means we lose nothing in terms of card advantage, while ideally our opponent loses a card or 2 from their field or a card from their hand. The more this happens throughout the game, the quicker our opponent will run out of resources until they inevitably lose. When it comes to the fusion deck, we use the same list I mentioned in my GOAT control video. A few things to note here are, Monarch decks have easy access to level 6 monsters, and those that play ZABORG have easier access to level 5s than most. Thousand Eyes is amazing in Monarchs, as they can remove a monster, then be tributed for a Monarch, giving us even more advantage. And in Soul Control, Soul Exchange combos amazingly well with Metamorphosis. Now the cards I've listed here are only some of the many options you have as a Monarch player. I chose these cards to showcase here because they have seen play in historical high profile versions of this deck, but this deck is so malleable that you can personalise it in many ways. Some builds include a warrior package with Exile Force and DD Warrior Lady, others go deeper into Chaos, adding Recruiters and Thunder Dragons, and others still include Gravekeeper engines with Spy and Guard, or even more use Apprentice Musician to find Faith and Mimic. What I'm saying is, if you want a deck that you can make your own, you could do a lot worse than Monarchs. Moving on to the spells of these decks, let's begin with the cards that let us tribute our opponent's monsters, as this is the main way our decks both gain card advantage and clear the field for attacks. We have 5 cards among these 2 decks: Snatch Steal, Creature Swap, Enemy Controller, Brain Control, and Soul Exchange. Now Snatch Steal is a card that I've mentioned several times in the past, so the only thing I will add here is that Monarch decks are so focused on tribute summoning that the chances of Snatch Steal's minuscule downside of giving an opponent 1000 life points every turn will likely never come up, as the monster will likely be gone the same turn we steal it. Next up we have Creature Swap, which allows us to exchange one of our monsters with our opponents. Now unlike the other control effects, this one is not going to be a flat out removal piece when combined with a Monarch, as the opponent gets one of our monsters as well. However, this card does have many other uses. Firstly, this card plus a recruiter like Mystic Tomato or a floater like Sangan is straight card advantage. Secondly, this card potentially gives us access to our opponent's effects, such as Magician of Faith, Dekoichi, and the Chaos monsters. And finally, if we use our own Faith and Dekoichi, this card gives our opponents a weak monster we can easily run over with one of our big beaters. Now out of the 3 Change Heart effects, aka spells that let you take control of your opponent's monsters for a turn, we'll begin with the only one that is played in both variants of the deck, and the only good card in Lost Millennium, Brain Control. A card that allows us to take control of one of our opponent's monsters for the small cost of 800 life points. Now this card is the only one played in both decks, as it has the smallest cost of the 3 spells. As such, 2 or 3 copies of this card are often seen in most versions of Monarchs. Next we have Soul Control's namesake card, Soul Exchange. Slightly different to the other cards in this category, Soul Exchange allows us to tribute a monster on our opponent's side of the field at the cost of our battle phase. Now while not taking control of our opponent's monsters does make this card slightly less versatile, as we can't use its effects or attack with it, this card does offer us the option of combining it with Metamorphosis, thus making Monarch one of the few decks in GOAT that can actually play all the fusions from level 1 to 8 somewhat reliably. Finally, the battle restriction of this card is the reason it doesn't see play in aggro builds, but in control decks this downside isn't too much of an issue, as we aren't looking to win quickly anyway, and like I said, Thessalos can help to compensate for this a little bit with his burn damage. Finally, we have the card that aggro Monarch decks tend to run instead of Soul Exchange, Enemy Controller. A quick play spell, Controller actually has 2 abilities. Firstly, this card allows us to tribute one of our monsters to steal one of our opponents, and it also allows us to change the battle position of one of our opponent's monsters. Now on the surface, this card is just a worse Brain Control. However, that second effect, combined with the quick play speed, makes this card a decent way of dealing with Tsukiyomi, which is the main benefit of playing aggro Monarchs or Soul Control, as Tsuk has often been a massive hurdle for Monarch decks to get over, seeing as it has all Monarchs have only 1000 defense points, and can be put and run over by her very easy. Outside of these control cards, most of the cards we run in this deck are fairly standard for GOAT format, and were covered in detail in my GOAT control video, so we'll do just a quick run through here. First we have the Trinity of Pot, Charity and Duo. Now everyone should know what these do by now, and the only thing I've got to add here is that Duo into Thessalos on turn 1 is a move that will likely secure your place in the 8th ring of Yugioh Hell. Next up we have the combo of Metamorphosis and Scapegoat, which is used for 1000 Eyes Restrict summonings. Metamorphosis, like I said, is extra powerful in this deck due to Soul Exchange giving us access to a variety of targets, and 1000 Eyes plus a Monarch can be a major source of card advantage. Also in both decks, Scapegoat offers us the chance to grind the game to a halt for a turn or 2 if we're light on resources due to either bricking, which can still happen in this deck, or our attack failing. This deck also runs the GOAT staples of Book of Moon and Nobleman of Crossout. Now with Faith, Dekoichi and Mimic, Book of Moon is very good at helping us recur and gain card advantage. However, like Enemy Controller, this card being a quick play, again gives both versions of this deck an answer to Tsukiyomi, and also a way out larger threats that we can't beat over, like Chaos monsters, especially when combined with Nobleman of Crossout. In addition to this, Nobleman can be used to out the format's best flip cards, making it a good pick against Chaos variants and Gravekeepers, and if we're already used our own flip cards, this card can give us an advantage versus other control decks, and especially in the mirror match. Just be careful when you use this card, because hitting a Faith or Decoy Chi before you use your own can leave you high and dry late game in terms of resources. Finally, we run Heavy Storm, which along with MOBIUS makes it very difficult for back row heavy decks to pose much of a threat against us. Finally, looking at the trap lineup, honestly there isn't much difference between both versions of this deck. Both versions run the GOAT format staples of Mirror Force, Ring of Destruction, Call of the Haunted and Torrential Tribute. The main difference is that aggro builds, due to the lack of monsters in comparison to the control deck, have space for aggro staple Trap Dust Shoot, whereas the control build, due to wanting the game to last long, has 3 Secret Armors as an extra way preventing attacks. Trap Dust Shoot by itself makes aggro Monarchs a powerful deck, as it allows us a quick and easy answer to Yugioh, since the card must return to our opponent's hand each turn and can't be easily brought back once sent to the graveyard. However, unlike other aggro decks, we don't run Solemn Judgment due to both lack of space and the strong potential that the life point cost can backfire on us, given that we don't generate the same field presence as other aggro decks like Gravekeepers, and thus can't always kill our opponent as fast as other decks. Some Monarch decks choose to play cards like Compulse and Removal Traps as another way of answering Yugioh, and others even choose to forgo traps altogether and simply run 3 Royal Decrees. Like most of Monarchs, this section of this deck is very up to personal choice. In terms of our side deck, we first run 3 7 Tools of the Bandit, as a way of both answering powerful traps like Mirror Force and outing any mascot restricts our opponent may have sided in against us. Some versions of the deck side in aggro staple Trap Dust Shoot if they don't main it for chaos matchups, as well as Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer. Others will side in a warrior package including Don Zalug for the edge and control matches, and Exile Force and Duty Warrior Lady to out big threats. Finally, of course, there's the obvious one-off staples we side for certain matchups like Necromonic King for combo matchups. Due to Yugioh, Monarch is unlikely ever to break into the top tier of GOAT format like it did in the format after it. However, based on its sheer popularity and its decent matchup against several top decks, it'll likely still see play for a long time. The Monarchs themselves remain the best visually designed monsters Konami have ever made, and I will always love this deck for being my first step on my path of being a competitive Yugioh player. Thank you all for watching, leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next video.